Welcome to the Potboiler. I'm Patrick Hughes, and this is Hollow Grim and the Winter in January, Part 1. Potboiler is an old term for pulpy paperback genre writing that I think deserves some sunlight. I hope you agree. Let's do the intro. On a desolate day in January, Hollow Grim is hunting deer on a familiar trail where Doc Shillington's land backs onto Judge Irving Jameson's expansive family property. Hiking the migration path Hollow has hunted on since his father used to take him every Sunday, a rifle shot across the valley suddenly makes him the hunted, taking shelter on the frigid cliffside. Unable to move without entering the rifleman's crosshairs and uncertain of his position, Hollow has the threat of quickly dropping temperatures, moving the urgency up as the sunlight continues to pass. He pours through his knowledge of Judge Jameson's past to keep his addled mind occupied in the cold and to form a suspect so he can mount his defense. 3 episodes of this story will be offered with no embedded commercial interruptions. Visit patrickhughes.ca for links to me and my other projects. And please stick around after the story for some light business. Enjoy. Let's play the music. Hollow Grim and the Winter in January. 6 January, 1897. You want this to be over, but you just emerged from December. There's still so much more to endure. Winter in northeastern Nevada is how I picture hell. Stories cast frightening images of fire and brimstone. But I always feel like I'm there, looking out at the frozen horizon to see the line of gray cut through the field of white. If you look long enough, you can forget which one is the sky. The hell I see this cold month is the absence of light. The torture and torment of unending emptiness, with nothing but your own ghost to taunt you. It's death without demise. This hell is a winter with no spring in sight. No end that will give you, or give the year, some kind of meaning. All I could see, crouched down in the rock on the ridge trail edge, were drops of my blood pooling in the snow, tiny wisps of steam quickly dying in the cold morning air. The sniper's second bullet had cut into my lower left rib. I didn't know how bad I was hit. I couldn't see the shooter's position in the valley below me. I had no idea what vendetta was playing out in this attack. I had only gone out for a short Sunday morning deer hunt. I was not prepared for a fight. January is a time to be endured. Surviving to the 31st day means little more than 60 more desperate days to follow. The people around me pass through my postal office, gripped in their winter wounds. Aged in a way they'll forget as they melt back in the spring thaw. left with a hidden scar that opens again in November. They pass through town for their necessaries, burdened by holding their own shoulders up, looking for a shared commiserating and a brotherly salutation I can't find the empathy to offer. I watch them, made all the more solitary by my odd fascination for this cold white purgatory. I want to tell them it's not going to end. It only feels like it. Perhaps I like that desolate is something I can count on. I've seen desperate. I've seen the winter on a man's face as he decides poorly one final time with a gun between him and I. Desperate grows tiresome. But desolate is fine by me, so long as I don't have to share it. I've always felt comfortable in that long dark before dawn. My name is Hollow Grim. I live in the winter of this western frontier experiment, on a wide white wasteland called Nevada. I run the postal office in my once bustling township called Progress. My days are spent avoiding wasteful pleasantries and stale questions about my famous lawman father and my own deadly rifle. I read every book and periodical within my reach. I hunt every Sunday when others go to church. And I watch this winter drain what it can from the life it covered in lifeless white. Occasionally I'm called upon by the office of the U.S. Marshal to fill a warrant beyond the depth of their deputies. I helped my father build our hunting shack on the northwest corner of Doc Shillington's expansive property on a ridge overlooking a stretch of plain once intended for the original path of the Union Pacific. The area was adjoining the rear of another sprawling property deeded under the name Cheney and owned by the last descendant's widower, retired federal Judge Irving Jameson. He was a central figure in many of my father's exploits and epilogues. In the courtroom, after all the gun smoke had cleared, the damage required a pass through the scales of justice. He later played the same figure in several of my own endings. We would hike in for the occasional overnight hunt on a Sunday or when my father sensed calm in Progress Township. Among our habits and practices, depending on the migrating prey, the only rule in that winter cabin was to maintain quiet. The rule suited both of our quiet demeanors just fine, rarely having much to say anyhow. From that first winter, just after my 11th birthday, we went about our chores, nodded approval at each other's tasks, and stayed comfortable in a warm, respectful distance. We would talk most on the nights we made a fire. But not of his heroic exploits he was tired of telling. We'd share short comments about the cold and the stars and avoiding anything with too much gravity. Don't worry about your hands getting cold. They're the easiest on you to warm up. Worry when your chest gets cold. He'd say the things that somehow seem the most significant, still now bouncing around in my head. One of those nights, I was somewhere between 12 and 14, somewhere between January and March. He stood in front of the fire and the moon, looked into something I couldn't see in the distance. The moment in and of itself was not that exceptional, but I've remembered it beyond so many others. How much of the world is a man willing to destroy if he doesn't care about a tomorrow in front of him? Would he just burn it all? There was more to his words than commentary or editorial. I'm not sure of the context that conjured it or the specific shadow that stayed with him. It stayed with me. I didn't appreciate it when he was here, that he was a man of constant burden. The ghost of his words rides with me every day. My hunting pattern was based on my father's highly regimented method in the winter months, following migration routes and standard weather patterns. It had become a habit of some comfort, despite laboring on my false right leg strapped to my amputated knee. Made me relatively easy prey on my own right, but over terrain that few locals and far fewer assassins could navigate. In January, I tended to choose the high path along the ridge to stay out of the wind and absorb a little heat gathered on the rock face from the sun. It was my favorite view when I found myself the permission to be distracted. There was a stillness in the wind across the forest floor that felt comforting for a lifeless winter day. The blanket of calm made a familiar disruption sound all the more out of place. A distant rifle shot rang out across the ridge with a crack that sunk in my stomach. It was not at all odd to hear the fire of another hunter's gun. The tone stung my ears like it was off-key and out of place. Instinct pulled me down into a crouch and widened my eyes. The shot was fired at me. It was a shot fired well. 2 bullets struck, one a half moment from the next. So close in succession they felt like 2 fangs in a snake bite. They hit the rock above me. The first close enough to force a shrug in my shoulders. The second was better. The 2-shot pattern had a significance impossible to overstate. You never shoot twice to start in the cold. Repeating bullets from a marksman, 2 or maybe 3, are used only as a demonstration tactic. 2 shots is otherwise quite unadvisable, as it can give away a great deal about yourself. 2 shots can confusingly appear to be from multiple shooters, or manipulate the sound to adjust the origin of the rifle report, or they can mask a getaway. Shooting at me, walking through the terrain of my home, was a substantial risk for any gunman. Firing the opening shot and pairing a second shot was a message, with punctuation. I got low and stayed down. The best advantage for the shooter was the cage he'd closed me in. Had no view over the edge at his position. The high ground is the advantage in every form of combat except mine. The gauntlet was down in front of me, and I couldn't look without putting myself in his line. I stayed down. I chose to wait for an opening. At least an hour quickly went by as the sun climbed the morning sky. The problem with that kind of delay was the potential for the right kind of hunter to exploit my vulnerability and repositioning on my shelter. The positioning had an accuracy that could not be random. The paired shots had to be an introduction. The shooter had talent, well matched to mine, if not better. The opening shots were more than expert in this cold. That would make him one of the best riflemen living. Targeting me was likely incidental. This routine of mine was known to very few people, and the difficulty seems unjustified. It was either a potential witness to be silenced or being misidentified as the proprietor himself, Judge Jameson. I did my best to make myself part of the terrain, sliding down between the rocks. As my analyst reflex moved around and through the evidence, I heard the bubble of liquid press beneath me. I was at first pleased to know there was some water close by. Should I be holding out more than a day until I got some air in and the adverse sensations of cold and warm startled me. I got my hand underneath my torso, careful not to raise the pair of inches that would be lethal. I couldn't tell how much of my blood had pooled beneath me, but as the rush of panic invaded, I could feel the wound from the second bullet below my lower left rib. My mind went in every direction, across anger and anxiety, as I looked into the still blue winter sky again, trying to find my calm. I relied on my knowledge of the valley and its terrain, waiting for something to indicate movement or point at a location. My rifle was beside me. I knew the bullet was through and stopping the bleeding would be vital. A wounded abdomen and no opportunity to inspect myself meant that I had no idea how much time was left for me here. A clock was ticking in my head, but I was at a mortal disadvantage to any rifleman in the best of circumstances. As I started the countdown to monitor my awareness, I was suddenly unsure what the shooter had seen of his strike and of my wound, which meant I could predict even less in his strategy. I hunt differently when the deer I'm after has caught one in the hip, but I have to know it first. I started to review in the slowest pace I could control everything I knew about the valley, the man who owned it, his enemies, and any evidence pointing me at those two shots. There was a dozen stories involving Judge Jameson, told mostly by Doc and my father, with Gertrude and any number of bandit gamblers in her tavern. Every harrowing exchange of frontier violence that would include him in the epilogue dropping his gavel, scolding my father, and saying something thoughtful about the impact of justice and balance. Judge Jameson was known for the sharpness of his temper with regard to courtroom procedure and any measure of perjury or excess showmanship on the part of the counsel before him. My father was as matter-of-fact as they came, often to a lethal degree with his application of the law. But he had moments of pause and occasional charity when it came to desperate people and their failings. Jameson was rigidly mathematical about how a person landed on the wrong side of the line and what they owed for breaching the social contract. He'd say otherwise, what the hell are we all doing here? Can always use another bank or a butcher shop. Several of his pearls had become touchstones for the legal acumen in Nevada. We seek truth, and we're better for it, but not here. We're here to finish that search by interpreting how imperfect laws apply to humans in their least perfect moments, whom I expect to be less than truthful in every account. Evidence matters here. Truth has little value in my court. It was bound to happen that one of the better killers he dropped his gavel on would one day come to his home and hunt him down. As many bad men would have likely celebrated his death as would have for the death of my father. It was less of a certainty and more of a product of my own bad fortune that in our decades-old trespass on the back of the judge's land, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. All I had on that ridge, lying in a growing pool of my own blood, was the volumes of stories I'd heard of the man over the years. To hone in on the potential suspect behind those two perfect shots. March. Born in Kentucky, a place he slighted at every opportunity, Jameson had the kind of childhood you have to survive, and grew up in the kind of place you have to flee. Kentucky is an old English word meaning unclean bedpan, he was known to say. Well past the shoulders of Doc's whiskey bottle, late one hot summer night in the Progress Tavern some years back, they stumbled into a conversation about the roads behind them. It began in my father's history. The son of a successful litigator from Scarborough, Ontario, Charlie Grimm shocked the family by leaving law school in Canada to head south and seek adventure in the Union Army. Doc continued with his own story. Leaving the American aristocracy, banished from the Shillington dynasty on the East Coast for his proletarian decision to study medicine and then serve in the military. The judge looked deep into his whiskey and started in his own story. The sheriff found me standing over my father's dead body. The knife I was holding was dripping with his blood. My clothes were painted in red. The only sound was my mother struggling for breath. She slowly succumbed to the damage of his final beating a few minutes later. The sheriff was my father's cousin. He was certain that revenge in the form of hanging of a 13-year-old murderer of his kin would send the message he was looking for about his authority and his justice. The new local judge didn't see things his way. His verdict was not guilty. My crooked uncle reacted like the ruling wasn't a legal possibility, further adding to the revenge he was owed. I accepted the judge's offer to stay behind with him in the court as the crowd dispersed. He answered all my questions about the law and its consequences. He'd seen all the consequences I could conjure up. I innately understood every legal structure he described like I could build them myself. He stopped for a sip from the glass, and as though he was staring through it. He said he had a clerk with an extra bedroom if I needed a place to stay, but all I wanted was a coach ticket north. I made my way to Cambridge, shoveled shit and coal. Went from fat and awkward to lean and healthy in under a month. Every free moment I had, I stood outside the front door of the law review office at Harvard until they gave me a job. Then I stood outside the dean's office until he let me take classes. I was admitted to the state bar before my 25th birthday. The first case I won as a federal prosecutor was against the same badge in Kentucky with my father's last name behind it. Again, he and his 3 deputized sons couldn't believe the law could function against them. They were so dumbstruck that they didn't think to protest. As the gallery of oppressed townfolk cheered when the marshals took them out, I stopped him at the door and took his badge. I put it in a frame. It's still up in my office with the dedication to my mother. Doc would add how the story had them snared. I was a judge 4 years later, the youngest to that point at the federal level. I was ravenous for the process of interpretation and judgment. In those first years, I was inspired constantly. The rule of the law can be philosophical when it's used well. It can help us unveil truth. Enough truth that we will evolve. I now no longer believe that. All I've got now behind my gavel is a measuring rope for human failing. Irving Jameson rightfully earned many enemies in his decades wielding his interpretation of the law. Objectively or philosophically, he was not for one day generous. The law had no place for friends. He'd earned the focus of someone's twisted justice, fired hot enough to hunt him down on his own property, cautious enough to keep their distance and mistake me for him, and apparently skilled enough to complete the task. May. I tried to turn my shoulder up slightly. Knowing that I wasn't getting sufficient pressure on my wound and had little idea how much blood I had lost. My extremities were getting colder, but still had feeling. I was losing track of time, which was not promising, but still felt aware of the sounds I was tracking in the valley. The wind direction and speed was constant. No stick or rock had cracked or moved. I employed my attention by exploring what I knew about the threats to the judge. With a chapter closed in Kentucky, he accepted a judgeship on a federal bench in Illinois. His exuberance and passionate legal interpretations delivered in every decision made him notable quickly. He was on every board of review and consultancy he could find time for, on shortlists for a variety of political appointments and fast tracks that ambitious young men dream about. Young Judge Irving Jameson was not ambitious. He served the legal system. He was there to bend bent sheriffs, make corrupt men check their numbers, and to take an eye when an eye was taken. He was earning a profile worthy of public note. The Chicago Tribune regularly cited him in their society section in the pages following an article of hotly anticipated court decision, where his handsome profile photograph could double a edition circulation. Being an honest man is never a secure state for long, especially in Chicago. His unflinching eye eventually put him in the glare of a local state senator who involved himself directly in certain matters fundamental to his constituents and profitable to him. His commerce was bartered permissions and future forgiveness. As the legend goes, when he came to the judge for a favor in a matter involving an interest of his, he was left quite dissatisfied. The vendetta grew between them and was never known to be settled. Despite the danger he created for himself, he learned quickly the fundamentals of keeping himself safe. He always had a reliable contact in law enforcement he knew he could trust, and a pistol holstered under his robe. And then he got restless. June. The judge's next chapter started with a debate in a Chicago gentlemen's club. Each of the versions of the story Doc heard down the bar rail, it began with a debate about the constitutional merits of state secession. At a time when the division was becoming an eventuality among the influential men in his field. We happened to be a 9, like the Supreme Court we all revered. Opinions fell sharply along the well-defined line. Doc and my father were enraptured, as they always were, with the judge's stories. If you came north to get to that table, the legal right to secede was based on a democratic decision at the state level, and every bit the spirit that formed the Union in the first place. If you saw Winters growing up, you seemed to think that the Union was designed not to offer that legal option, and the grounds for their departure were not quite as virtuous as the ones that formed the Constitution. And the virtue of any Southern gentleman is questioned. The tone then seems to turn to challenge. We started to debate the increasing fervor what would and should be done. We quickly passed diplomatic gestures, sanctions, and market limitations into the efforts rumored to be gathering in Richmond, Virginia. I was the youngest at that table by quite a stretch. Beauregard Montgomery was next youngest at 10 years my senior. The same one that would later go on to be the senator of Mississippi, the senior side for the rest of the century. He knew the sweetest way to make any argument bitter. The challenge he was building towards was meant to make the matter personal and the argument unwinnable. Given my age, barely past 30, the challenge was obvious. A week before or after, my answer would have been completely different. But breathing the stale air around me, sealing his smug face shut, was totally worth it. He said, "My daddy was always better at selling cotton than growing it. He conducted the buyers at auction like an orchestra, setting whatever market price he thought sounded musical. The whole state waited at his auction to set their margins. That world from bottom to top, black dirt, black hands, white cotton, white hands, white money, it's all in my family's bloodstream. It's in the red on that flag above us, stars and stripes, or stars and bars. We'd all put down our lives for it, given the opportunity. The question I ask you, Judge Jameson, how do you measure your opportunity against the right contribution?" The expectation was obvious. He had no intention of seeing me leave for battle, but merely wanted to have me eat my own words. The young men of this country have got to learn to put up or be quiet. Well, I didn't say a word in retort. I had a fire in me still that needed to singe him in a quiet way that he couldn't turn into a rhyme. I thanked the men as etiquette dictated and left the table graciously. I had my military admission papers couriered to Beauregard directly. There was no way I could avoid service as an officer, but I avoided as much command as I could. I eventually took over a regiment of skirmishers and riflemen. Not one day did I look regretfully on that decision. I learned a thing or two about putting a man to death. They were bad years in most ways, and those ways that war can be bad. I know my men felt a similar satisfaction. Those were the best years of my life. Accepting that we all look back in a rose color. And of course, this is the time I met you both, the degenerate doctor and his gunfighter friend. The man in front of my bench, more than the reptilian litigators. I must have sent that righteous buffoon Montgomery 60 postcards in 5 years. There's a special place in having a powerful man hate you like poison. Any newsprint notoriety Jameson had amassed in his handful of years in Chicago was completely eclipsed by the onslaught of articles about the judge that had voluntarily enlisted for military service. He went from headline to legend. I could barely measure my injury, but I knew my lack of sensation was a problem. The fingertips on my left hand that I pressed against my thumb, one after the next, were clearly not refilling with pink. My blood pressure was dropping. Cold was overtaking me. I was starting to see an ending. To be continued in part 2. Thanks so much for listening to Hologrim and the Winter in January, part 1. Part 2 should be in the feed within a week or so. In part 2 of 3, as Hollow's position on the frigid cliffside continues to worsen, his thoughts pour through the eventful life of Judge Irving Jameson, who he figures must be the target he's been mistaken for by the sniper that has him trapped and bleeding out. Any information, any evidence, any escape is absolutely necessary before the winter takes him. Let's do the call to action. If you like the story so far and you want more, you feel compelled to throw your support in my direction, the fastest route is through my website, patrickhughes.ca. There you'll find access to my other projects, links to my books and ebooks on various platforms, and a contact me function. You can also lend your valuable support by liking and subscribing and sharing on whatever platform you're visiting. It really makes a difference. Please add your voice and with a quick click, or let someone know if you like what you hear. I do hope you share this. Don't keep any good fiction a secret. Thanks.